Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's episode of Action Items. I am so excited for the guest that we have today. I cannot think of a time when we had a software vendor on the show. And if you guys follow me, if you know me, I am very skeptical of supply chain software and all of the promises that are made from the software vendors, despite the fact that I do software implementations, or maybe because of the fact that I do software implementations. So I'm super excited to have one of our trusted partners when it comes to supply chain planning software to join me for the show today and really talk about just scaling up your supply chain. I like to call it baby's first supply chain, and really getting some structure and some best practices around your product operations and making sure that you have the digital tools to support. So as always, this episode is brought to you by NewGen Architects, a digital transformation consultant agency, helping businesses navigate the complex world of technology and supply chain management. The NewGen Architects team of supply chain experts works with clients in all phases of the implementation lifecycle, from initial planning to post-implementation support. This includes things like ERP tool selection, project management, and business transformation roadmaps. To learn how NGA can support your business to scale, visit newgenarchitects.com for more information and to schedule a discovery session with a member of the team. So 2 minutes in, you guys have heard enough from me. Let's bring up Ryan from Modus Planning, CEO and founder.
Awesome. Great to be here with you, Dyci. Really appreciate it.
Good morning. Now, remind me where you are. Are we on the same time zone? It's 10 a.m. for me.
Yeah, same here. I'm in sunny Baltimore, Maryland.
Blocks
away from the water, a lot of crab cakes, really fun.
Cool. Any fun weekend plans?
Basically, I know there's multiple wine festivals in Baltimore. It's a fun town. Definitely encourage people to check it out. I know the wife is very much geared towards the wine festival, so I've got to.
Okay.
Yeah, that's gonna be fun.
Perfect. Fun. All righty. So give everyone in our audience or watching on our recording here a little bit of background of your journey starting Modus and how your work as a supply chain practitioner in product planning led you to create Modus and what that journey has been like as you've been working with customers, because you guys have dozens of customers now. So what is that journey been like for you?
It's been wild. It really has. I right out of school, I studied supply chain management at the University of Maryland, and right from the jump, I knew exactly that is what I wanted to do, because there were so many inefficiencies. I also paired that with information systems, because it just seemed like there was so much to accomplish in supply chain, and that was years ago. But basically, right out of school, I went to work at Unilever Supply Chain, which was an incredible decision. I basically did all things planning and execution for the North American ice cream division, for the Popsicle brand, Breyers, Ben & Jerry's, all of those amazing, iconic brands that everyone loves. It's so funny. My friends from business school, they were dealing with bond prices where I was working on making sure SpongeBob pop-ups got to the shelf on time, right? Much more fun. And so I really fell in love with the supply chain, where it was so dynamic. But there was something there, right, in terms of demand planning and what it means to be a demand planner. A lot of people think of demand planning as, okay, this is a statistical model. I'm going to tweak some variables and make sure it's right. I take a look at demand planning as you are essentially a diplomat, right? That you have to bring all of these stakeholders to the table and make sure you get all of the correct information, so that you can understand, what's coming, what's sales doing, right? What is marketing doing? All of those things have tremendous impact on the brand. And so I used, obviously statistical modeling in my day-to-day. However, when the rubber hit the road, it was really in that S&OP meeting. And even with these processes, even with these models, right, there were still substantial potential near misses that occurred, right? So, learning about a pallet program that was happening at Kroger 2 weeks away, right? Learning about that and trying to figure out, okay, how can I get the stock in the right place at the right time? Similarly, new item launches with unique ingredients, right? I remember in a new item launch, the initial forecast was, for Walmart was 2 SKUs across 200 doors. I give the guys in Bentonville a call, and basically they say, no, it's all 4 SKUs across full chain, all 4,000 stores, and we're launching with an end cap. So right there, it, obviously, like, I got flushed, and I went directly to the director to say, hey, look, procurement needs to be looped in. And it's one of those things where if I hadn't made that call to actually talk to the people on the front line, that launch could have been significantly rockier than it was, which is great because we got all of it on time. Then in 2016, I was fortunate enough I went from a multinational, right, huge organization, really excellent team there. We went over to Icelandic Provisions, where I was the 5th employee. And so Icelandic Provisions, that was obviously a huge shift from a multinational to a startup. But the problems were still the same. So, right, trying to, even though there was just one salesperson in charge of the entire country, right, trying to grab all of those inputs, right, they're selling product left and right, trying to make sure all those inputs were in place was huge. And so when I first stepped foot into Icelandic Provisions, as demand planning, S&OP lead, all things sort of execution, order management, those types of things, I knew that I had to build a model, right? And this is the same story that countless CPG brands go through pretty much every day, is they have these homegrown models. They're all modeling essentially the same information, right? Instead of using statistical models, they're using bottom-up builds, right? Where they know their retailers, their SKUs, their velocities, all of those things. And they're creating these models, and they get very complex very quickly as the brand gains in distribution, as they create more depth in their distribution. And so it can be a lot to handle. I mean, I've seen more planning files than I can count, and I've seen some serious sort of abstract art, I like to call it. But it's funny, everyone is trying to do the same bottom-up build when you're a small and growing business. And so I took a really hard look at it. I'm like, this isn't working. Meanwhile, I looked over at the marketing and sales department, and they're building almost the exact same model, right? So they're doing units per store per week, the retailers, the SKUs, all of that. But they're overlaying trade promotion management variables. They're overlaying sales planning, gross sales, things that as a supply chain guy, I just speak in cases. That's really all I cared about. But I realized something that was key is that, structuring bottom-up planning data, right, where you have your retailers, your distribution maps, all of that is a huge undertaking. But it really only works when you bring everyone to the table, when you have sales getting what they need from the system simultaneously with operations. And so that's when I call up my buddy from the University of Maryland, who is my co-founder, and I basically said, hey man, we've talked to consultants, we've talked to peers in the industry. There isn't any way to structure this bottom-up data. I think there's an opportunity here. And within about, I think, 48 hours from hearing that, he quit his job to work full-time on Modus. And I mean, a ton of faith there.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure.
You're like, dude, it was just an idea.
It definitely goes to the faith that he put into the idea. And I think, honestly, I think that decision really, it's kind of like burn the boats mentality, right? But it's a hard thing to kind of articulate, but I do think that with enough time and effort and energy, right, you will eventually be successful. And I think he saw that path and has that persistence, and that's what we really, all of us on the team, really do try to bring that persistence.
Right. I normally will keep a notebook so that I can say, oh, I don't want to interrupt my guest, but this is the point I want to go back to. This is the point I want to go back to. I was like, I'm not going to need a notebook. I'm I know it now. And now I'm like, I wish I had a notebook. I wish I had a notebook. Like, what were all of the points? So the first thing for sure that stood out to me as you started to speak was just, I remember that our first action item is when you're thinking about the planning and execution of how to develop your startup is a collaborative process. Like define a collaborative process. And you just talked a lot about talking across the aisle, per se, to marketing and sales and getting these different inputs and getting this different data. And it made me think about a process. We helped a customer last week, a client. We worked with a customer, last month, and they are transitioning from having all of their operations completely outsourced to bringing it in-house and trying to figure out, okay, what data are we going to need? Who will we need to hire? What can we do? And they're a small team, small product mix, not very complex. And I remember not necessarily struggling with from my end, but thinking like, how do I communicate that they only need one person for the volume, et cetera, but you still need to have the mentality of demand planning, production planning, purchasing, like if maybe only one person is doing it, but all of these different inputs that you talked about, that one person still needs to be able to do and get all of those inputs. Whereas if it were a multinational like Unilever, you have different departments and you're talking to these different departments, but within the context of a small company or a startup company, you still have to do the same motions. It's the same processes. It's just fewer people doing and executing on everything.
Right.
So I really like how you talked about how it wasn't a big difference when you went from Unilever to Icelandic Provisions. Like the processes are still the processes. The steps
Right.
are still the steps. Like the demand planning process, like still that. And it's interesting because I've talked to another guest that we're having on the show later this year. She wasn't able to make it last year. And when we were talking about S&OP from the production side, she was like, DC, S&OP, yes, great. It's best practice. It just looks different at, the startup level. And it does look different, but fundamentally, you're doing the same, best practice steps. Hopefully, you're doing the same best practice steps. So we're defining a collaborative process. That's action one. And we're doing that from the beginning. And I like that you say doing that from the beginning, because the other thing that we were working with this startup on is that, when you come into a larger organization and we're trying to do S&OP planning, and it's that entire cultural shift of convincing the salespeople they should talk to operations, and why do they need to talk to supply chain, and what is this trade and promotional data that we need in order to be able to execute on this new product introduction or a limited time offer. I mean, my very first real project was limited time offers for Chick-fil-A, and how do we allow them to just pull these SKUs and then track this new group of complementary items for a 16-week period. And then after that, it just goes back into whatever the regular planning is of these SKUs. So those types of inputs and data, like you said, it doesn't come from the stat forecast. And it doesn't come from you as the demand planner on the supply chain side, just sitting and looking at stuff. It comes from reaching out and having these regular conversations. But you also need, with a larger team, the other people on the other side to also say, yes, I understand why I need to make this meeting a priority. I understand what the data points are that Ryan is looking for on the demand planning side so that he can do ordering. So how do I now culturally prioritize that? If you start from the beginning, everyone just knows. It's not this big, oh my goodness, we've never done this before. No one will come to the meetings. It's something that you just do. And I want to say that we also talked about that last year with Mason-Dixon. And they mentioned how Modus was a driving force around them being able to do that from the start of creating their S&OP process.
No, absolutely. And you touched on everything 100%, right? And it's all about that collaboration. And we have a core belief with Modus where better planning outcomes come from aligning behaviors across the organization, right?
Mhm.
And so typically, right, when you think of software in a CPG, you think of a demand planning application, which is high level stat model based typically. And then you look at a trade promotion management system, which are completely separate point solutions. And that is something where I had this sort of epiphany. I'm like, well, if my sales director plans a BOGO at Publix and I'm going through the KHE network, right, to fulfill that buy one, get one, I need to have the TPM directly integrated into my S&OP process. Similarly for new item launches. And so basically by integrating those two aspects, it's been critical to make sure that nothing is lost. Similarly for marketing, right? I can't tell you how many times I've heard of someone putting, IRCs or an Ibotta program together or some sort of major marketing activation, and supply chain's the last one to know about it. And so because all of that spend is captured and the gross sales is captured in Modus, and that's really part of the collaboration, right? Where the marketing sales teams, right, they're putting all that information in. Finance loves that, right? Because they have all of the spend. And then supply chain can see it and knock it out of the park.
I have
And
a question for you, Ryan, because I know that we were talking a couple of weeks ago about a potential process where the customer or our client is getting the stat forecast from another system that is not disaggregated. It's just like the entire stat forecast for the entire country. And this now has to be disaggregated across states and markets and their different customers, et cetera. And we talked about bringing that stat forecast into Modus and using that data to also create the forecast, from layering on the trade and promotions and all of the different marketing and sales inputs. But in a world where you don't have that stat forecast, at this level, at this size of company, or maybe it's not even the size of company. How do I phrase this? I guess, like, what are the factors to where you would say having a stat forecast actually makes a material difference versus this collaborative demand planning that you're talking about, and being able to actually, because, like, are you going to be overriding your stat forecast so much that it doesn't even make sense to have the stat forecast until when, like, when does, or maybe never, maybe you don't have a business that is going to ever be that stable, which is not the correct word, or consistent, to where a stat forecast actually makes a difference. Did I explain that in my question, in my roundabout way of whatever just happened?
no, I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense. So, I think there are a couple of factors here at play with the stat model. Stat models can always be a data point, right? And a frame of reference. However, my sense is that if you're a small and mid-sized business, right, and you're growing, you're anywhere from 0 to 100, 250 million, right? Then you really want to keep on that bottom up planning methodology, in my opinion. The stat model is often, in my opinion, from what I've seen, used because the bottom up planning data just isn't available and does not scale to after a certain point. That's sort of the problem we're solving with it. So I always think that a bottom up build is excellent because you can actually see pinpoint, okay, why did the forecast change, which accounts, which SKUs, all of that. You can really get down into the detail. The other thing that I will note, and part of the planning and execution for growing brands, part of the action items here is really understanding your distribution map, because it's not enough to plan at the retailer, but you have to also, from my experience, the most effective brands plan the distribution through to the retailer, right? So if you're going into Whole Foods, for instance, and you plan your volume through UNFI, that allows you to do a couple of things, right? So all of a sudden, sales, they have their forecast at Whole Foods, which is everything that they need. Operations has the forecast by ship to, right, which is what they need. Now, in terms of statistical modeling, the statistical model is built from very typically from orders sent from the manufacturer to the ship tos. And in my experience, right, if you're a small and growing brand, you're pretty much beholden to the distributor ordering models. And those distributor ordering models can be can be incorrect, right? And a huge learning in the small and mid-sized business category in CPG is that demand planning isn't just about making a guess, right? It's not about saying, hey, here's what we think is going to be ordered. It's really about, okay, here's what we are very confident should be ordered because we understand all of the sell-through dynamics. We understand our promotional schedule. We understand our seasonality. Here's what really should be ordered. Are those orders coming in correctly? Or am I going to be out of stock because a promotion didn't get loaded into the distributor's system? Or am I, and this actually happened to me once, did a buyer accidentally add a zero and now I'm going to spoil out of hundreds of thousands of dollars of product? Seeing that stuff coming from a mile away and preventing it, which we definitely did, preventing it is really key because no one's going to advocate for your brand like you. And so being able to vet and validate those orders. And that's another component of what we've built, right, is if sales plans that BOGO at Publix, again, I go back to the Publix BOGO example like all the time. And that goes through KHE, right? Demand planning can understand, okay, here's the lift and here's the incremental volume that should be ordered. Is it actually happening? Which then, I mean, you can save on shelf availability, you can save on times and all of that by really taking an active role in validating orders. It's hard to do, but that's why we try to provide the architecture to get that done.
I have that made me think about 2 points. The first one where you essentially answered the question that I asked, or that I tried to ask, that you understood. In that stat model is when you don't have, bottoms up. And when you say it that way, thinking back on my experience and having built out models for people and talking through the pains, that's exactly what it was. It was difficult with the large complexity of, this was Coca-Cola, Kimberly-Clark, like I'm thinking, billion-dollar companies, of all of these different lines of businesses across different planning regions, across different countries with FX rates and, all this other factors, to be able to quickly say, okay, but bottoms up, what are we doing? So their planning method has been, okay, finance gives us a country forecast, and we take that country forecast, and this level of the organization does it by like different regions within that country. This level of the organization does it by like their area within that region. But there was no way other than a stat forecast to say, okay, this is my high level, take some information and now disaggregate that down to everyone. Because of like, otherwise, how do you kind of get a bottoms up? When you're small enough to be able to say, like, I know what my 20 SKUs are doing all the time, and I'm going to roll it up, then you don't need, or not to say that you don't need the stat forecast, but having that stat forecast provides less value. And I think that's an important point to make, especially in the world of companies trying to choose supply chain technology. And there are so many technologies out there right now that are saying we have a built-in algorithm that creates a stat forecast for you. And it's one of those things where, like, I implore companies to say, but do I need that? Does that work for my business? Is it something that is actually going to provide more value than spending that money on that time or something else? Because also in startup world, it's higher stakes. The cash, you are accounting for it significantly more. You want to make sure that you get your ROI. So you want to make sure that you're investing in the right tool. So that was the first point that I really took away from that and want to drive home for everyone and kind of bring that full circle. And then I don't remember what the second thing is. So it might come back to me, it might not, but just checking the time and making sure we get through the action items. Nicole, will you flash up action item number 2? So understanding preventable drivers of go-to-market costs. So what's that, Ryan? You came up with that one. So what are we really focusing on from that perspective?
So I think there's a couple of areas, right? One is too much working capital in the warehouse, which I think essentially everyone struggles with, right? Because if their plan is off a bit, right, they want to make sure that they have stock in-house, which, from a small business perspective is very expensive because it takes away from opportunities to actually drive trial and grow. And so working capital is one thing. And then if you're a perishable brand, spoilage. Even if you're a non-perishable brand, we've seen situations where between order lead times and shelf life guarantees, the spoilage is happening essentially, at the distributor or on shelf, and they're getting charged back for it. So those two things, right, in terms of working capital, spoilage, and then of course there's other supply chain costs. I know a lot of times 3PLs charge case picking fees, things of that nature, where you should really optimize to full pallets, full truckloads, all of that. And basically having line of sight into how many pounds are you shipping based on the sales forecast is really important. So I think those three things are really key steps. So just going back to talk about working capital. So oftentimes I hear this time and time again where it's like, okay, we don't know how this promotion is going to perform. We don't know when we're going to be on shelf. We don't know when the order is going to come through for the slotting of the product into the retailer shelves. And so part of that collaboration, and again, you're going to hear this from me time and time again, right? Harping on that collaboration, that single source of truth. Because if you can really remove the ambiguity from those shelf reset dates, when there is line of sight, not only in the S&OP window, but for the balance of the year, when you can really understand that and feel confident about it and know who's responsible for inputting that data, and make sure you talk to them on your monthly S&OP cadence or weekly cadence in some instances, you can start to really gain that trust in the demand plan. And when you do that, right, you can then start to walk back working capital. Additionally, things such as distributor forward buys, right, or what are called bridge buys, right, that can be incredibly disruptive to a supply chain. That's when basically you're giving a discount period to a distributor and they want to stock up enough to make it to the next discount period. That stuff happens. And not only does it really impact the sales budget, it also impacts supply chain, right? When you're filling these cases, when you're cutting someone who actually needs the product. So we want to make sure that by doing that order validation, right, that I alluded to earlier, as well as making sure that, what is being ordered is correct, right? We can have more confidence to be able to bring down that working capital, to free up cash flow, to then drive the business and really just invest in driving trial, marketing, right, and actually growing the top line as well. So that is, I think, a key action, is to really have that faith in the forecast, by not only understanding who is inputting the forecast, how is it changing, how is it performing, and really understanding the why behind it. I think is huge.
That made me remember the point, that my second point is that you're talking, like, your experience is very much CPG, and especially like perishable items. You talked about ice cream, and I know that you and I have talked offline about just like a frozen yogurt customer that we had, and the interesting thing that I find, and one of the things that really helps me to drive home the point of our value prop at NGA, is how, like, there are so many fundamentals of supply chain that are industry agnostic. And I was actually just reading an article yesterday about concrete manufacturers and how they're like managing changes in demand, and like 4 tips. And as I was reading it, I was like, or maybe any manufacturer, like not just concrete manufacturing. Like, so like the idea of working capital, and then kind of going back to the second thought, you were talking about distributors and understanding how that affects you as the brand. Like, manufacturers go through that also, and pretty much any company that uses any industry that uses a distribution network, you have to work with your distributors to understand how that affects what you have to do, manufacturing as the OEM or as the brand and CPG. So it's just been interesting to me to hear you talk about things that we've talked about, at least in my career, I've heard the same pain points, the same concerns, the same, how do we make this work with pharma, with, retail, with medical devices, with heavy machinery, with modular construction, like the fundamentals of collaborative demand planning, understanding your shipping costs, your freight lanes, the different, they're not hidden costs because you're getting a bill for it, but you don't really think about it unless you are mindful and conscious of it. And there are times where I sit with a customer or even a prospect and I say, well, how much are you being charged for this? What are your costs for this? Are you actually sure that you're optimizing cost by shipping to this location and then distributing directly to your customer from that location? Or is it better if you go around the way this way? Have you thought about doing that? And so many times companies will say, oh, our 3PL handles that, or our distributor handles that. And it's like, but do they? Or, but do they? Because you're not actually giving me the data that I requested. So you're just getting a bill and you're paying for it, but you don't actually know what goes into those costs. And these are preventable drivers of go-to-market supply chain, excess supply chain costs. And so many companies just don't think about that. So I'm really glad that you talked about that.
S&OP isn't just internal, right? It's the entire value chain, down to the retailer, down to the distributor, and it's so key. And the second part that I mentioned is spoilage. What's really wild is these, as a growing brand, right? Spoilage is such an issue, and out of stocks are also an issue because the algorithm. You don't want to be a victim of the algorithms that your distribution partners are using, and you have no visibility into. And so, really, a huge part of that is, and in CPG, right, in spoilage, if you sell product to a distributor, there's a very good chance that you're going to get billed back for any product that spoils, not only at the distributor but also on shelf. That was a key learning for me going into the small business arena in CPG, where you really had to have that, people call it extreme ownership, right? You had to have that complete value chain ownership across, and really start to advocate for yourself, not only at the distributor but also with the retailer on the shelf, and really work internally to make sure that, okay, if we're seeing spoilage risk, how do we mitigate it? How do we really look around corners to see that coming? And of course, you can get into this bullwhip effect, right, that we know about in supply chain, where spoilage occurs, cuts occur, then the distributor orders more to compensate for those cuts, and then you spoil some more, and so really, it's just whiplash, right? But really trying to make sure that you can see around those spoils and make sure the right amount, and you can kind of pull up out of that cycle much quicker. And it's critical for growing brands because they just do not have the excess burn to just say, hey, okay, there you go, have fun with that, spoilage money.
Exactly. It happened. We learned from it though. And like, sure, you say it, but it doesn't hurt any less.
Exactly.
All right. What is our third action item? This is a good one. And I'm gonna let you speak on it first because you are my guest. But what are some techniques brands can use to qualify tech partners when they're trying to figure out, and even just supply chain partners? And we talked about distributors, we talked about 3PLs. You just mentioned like the S&OP process is also outside of, let's say, the four walls of your business. So when it comes to supply chain partners and even tech vendors, you've been on both sides of the screen. You've been on the side where you're looking for the tech and you're trying to qualify to see, is this really going to work for us? And you've been on the side of explaining, yes, it exactly is what I'm looking for. And I know that I'm going to be able to support you. So what are some tips and tricks there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so basically, from a qualification standpoint, I really look, and even as a tech vendor, I also have vendors. So it's kind of a
Very
weird, right?
true.
It's like nesting doll of vendors in my head. But essentially, I really look to, do they understand the problem? Is it visceral for them? And this is sort of where I come from, right? And so that's really my core ethos is, is this problem something that they fully understand, and is it proven, right? Because typically, right, there's a value equation that you bring to every prospect, right? Every brand who is potentially looking for a solution, right? You're bringing a value equation to them, right? Which includes, okay, is this real? What's the likelihood that this is going to happen? Is this person really understand where we're coming from, and what's the risks associated with it? And so in order to really optimize that, right, we have to really understand, okay, what are the major roadblocks for brands, and I'm sure people selling me software, they're also thinking about these things, but really that's a key, right? Do the vendors sort of bring that, I would say, empathetic step forward toward in their contracting, in their pricing model, in their support model, right? So just implementing a TPM is great, but if that vendor sort of just leaves after maybe a 2-week, 3-week onboarding period, and you have and then you hire someone new and you have no resources and no training time, and you can't get in touch with them, and there's a 72-hour cycle time between emails, that's not great, right? And so really being able to see that literal human empathy in the vendors, that I think is a very, very strong indicator. And so, for me, right, from my perspective, we integrate with clients with Slack, right? We're available as much as humanly possible, right? Very flexible terms, low cost, all of that stuff, really trying to lower the barriers to entry for these brands. But still, it's one of those things where, does this, and then after the whole empathetic human side of the equation, does the solution actually work, right? And so this is a very, you can do demos, right? You can give people, guided tours. You can let them play around in the system. But I think ultimately it really comes down to, are there peers in the industry, right? Is this a reputable system, right? So I know there are a number of systems out there that, I've recommended and all of that, where it's like, okay, this has worked for me. I get it. And this is sort of how I would grow a business. Here's what I would implement, and all of that. So, and I think looking at, just zooming out for a CPG brand, I think the core components, what they need is they need something for their transactions, right? So making sure they have that general ledger in the cloud, right, in a system. They need to have a transaction layer. I think one of the biggest action items, if you're starting a brand or you're growing, you're going into retail, you need to make sure that you have a very strong order management system so that you can pull your orders, you can analyze those orders. You're not missing orders. They're not being sent to an inbox that's putting them into spam or junk mail. That happens, and it's terrifying. So having that transaction layer really robust from the get-go will save a ton of time and a ton of heartache. And then where Modus sits, right, is what we call the planning layer, right? Typically, this is just an array of spreadsheets, but we bring that all together, where it's promotion planning, et cetera. So I do think that brands should try to qualify technology vendors in each of those 3 tiers. And from a supply chain perspective, I was looking at, carriers, I was looking at 3PLs, things of that nature. It was really all about, if I see my temperature logger dipping below, 35, and will you pick up the phone on, I don't know, Christmas Eve, which actually I had to work, but anyway, having that, having that sort of sense of urgency for a perishable product, when you're hand to mouth on everything, right, in a startup, having that is, I think, absolutely key. So collaboration again comes to play there.
So from the technology side, how often you talked about making sure that the product actually works? And I know I've been part of developing POCs, these proofs of concept, and it's a significantly shorter implementation. And it is normally, paid for at cost, just to see if it's going to be a good fit. Um, I I don't know. Like I haven't done the data or the research to say it actually really made a significant difference. Um, what has been your experience? Do you guys do POCs? Is it worth it? Have you asked for POCs in the past? Or is it really just a matter of having like asking the right questions during the scoping and showing the right features during the demo, and making sure again that, like you mentioned, that the sales team and the vendor actually understands your problem? Because on one hand, I feel like, well, if it's the right product for you and they understand the problem and it has the right functionality, then you can see that in a demo. If you can't see it in a demo and you still need a POC, maybe something's not exactly right and you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, a round peg in a square hole.
No,
So I'm on the fence. Personally, I'm on the fence.
it's great questions. And I think you touched on something where it's asking the right questions at the initial engagement. And so, anytime I talk to a new brand, the key is to learn what are their problems, right? Like what, and so we have a list of 25, 30 problems on a slide we go through, and we have basically a slide for every single problem, how Modus solves it, and the proof that it can. And so the goal is to really understand their pain points and then tie it back to how do we fix it. And it's really that simple from a vendor perspective, and it's really key because that means we can then understand their context with a lot more clarity, and that just allows us to drive value quicker. The other thing, in terms of proofs of concept, I think they have to be very, very impactful, because I think just having the data in the portal, seeing it. Well, first of all, we do POCs quite a bit, and I think of it in terms of, hey, we can load in any planning files. We can do it quite quickly. We're pretty adept at it, and worst case scenario, we get better training on how to import data faster. And so I look at it at that angle. But I think a POC has to have a strong POV. I'm going to coin that. But because to make it really impactful. So for instance, if we were able to integrate the plans with scan data or order data, and we were able to drill down and find major opportunities in that POC, I would say this is excellent. Here's immediate value. Let's do this thing. But of course, right, if it's strictly just the instead of having like our dummy data, right, having their products and it being, it's like, okay, this is just the demo you showed me just with our product names. So that's not as impactful. So, we really try to basically drive that value and that relevancy. And I think another very core component is, what does that future state look like, right? Like, what are the processes that you're doing now? What does it look like? And how long does each step in that process take? And so if you can really inextricably tie the system to the problems that you're solving, and you can really clearly illustrate the processes and the new world that the brand's going to live in, I think that's a formula for a successful engagement.
I love the POV, proof of value, and making sure that even from a demo perspective, what is the value that is really, that the software is really going to bring in the implementation of digital. But also, like, I feel like that onus is on the software vendor to be able to prove that, to be able to ask the right questions. But also there's some onus on the brand to be able to think, what am I trying to get out of this? What is the ROI that I'm expecting? What is my pain? And not just putting all of it on the vendor and the partners to try to figure out. Like, you also have to understand your business and your team and know where you're going. So we are down to under a minute, and I have to do my little goodbye. So thank you so much for joining, Ryan. It was great. And we're live again June 9th. Thank you, Nicole. We're live again June 9th next month. I am actually going to be doing that show from Valencia, Spain, with an architect firm, Casas and House in Spain, that also does all of their modular manufacturing and a lot of their procurement and logistics in-house. And I'm excited to see how they use supply chain collaboration to make $1 million modular homes for people and move them and assemble them. So I'm super excited about that. And if you liked this show and it resonated with you and you're seeking hands-on support for your business to figure out how to scale your supply chain and implement digital technologies, visit nugentarchitects.com and talk with a member of the team. If you want to be sure to never miss a show and catch all the recordings, make sure you sign up for our newsletter at nugentarchitects.com and follow us on LinkedIn as well as Let's Talk Supply Chain. All right, everyone, have a great weekend. Thanks for joining. Thanks again, Brian.